Am I talking into this okay? No? No? Okay, so one of the things I keep hearing about this amazing exhibition put on by my colleagues is that it escapes any easy categorization of what it means to be Asian American or to make Asian American art. And I can say that even though I've known a lot of these people who are both friends of Anna's and in her network, because the Asian American network here is both small and big, there are ways that they're grouped together that have had illumination for me in terms of connections I never saw before between different people's work. So that was cool. I'm going to start a little bit talking about food and this book by Larissa Lai. And then we'll move into walking and talking about the show. Okay. So I recently read Larissa Lai's book, The Forgotten Century, a fictional novel set in Hong Kong before and during Japanese occupation. The story is a family story told by great aunt Violet Ma to her niece Ophelia over a meal in a Chinese restaurant. It is June 30th, 1997, and Ophelia is in Hong Kong to witness the handover of Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic of China, as well as to get some answers to questions she has about her family history. They go into a restaurant to wait out the rain, which keeps them from witnessing history firsthand, and the personal retellings are intertwined with and interrupted by the larger, wetly obscured political backdrop and the dishes that they eat. One thing that struck me while reading this story is the way that history is experienced as snippets of family drama, half understood in its significance. Some of them grow to mythological status later. Others, too traumatic or shameful to be faced directly, are completely repressed. The next generation often experiences these things indirectly as a black hole, something kept invisible and hidden that nonetheless shapes the space they move through in the present. And I feel like there's a lot of that happening in this exhibition, which I'll talk about a little bit when we're walking through. When the niece asks questions to get more details to her questions, the aunt conveniently changes the subject, or conveniently the food appears, and a lavish description of crab or congee mixed with 1,000-year-old eggs fills the place of the trauma we can't confront or deal with yet. This really haunted me when I read Larissa Lai's story because it felt so familiar to my own experience at the kitchen table, running up against the edges of some story. My mom would say something like, "Oh, you know, your dad, his brother survived the Cultural Revolution by electrocuting fish." And I'd be like, "What? How?" And she's like, "Oh, you got a factory, there was like a tractor battery he found." Or, "Oh yeah, my dad was part of the group that executed warlords." And you're like, "Wait, he was a murderer?" Well, everybody was doing that, and it's like this kind of quick dismissiveness, and you never kind of really get to the bottom of these family histories. And I think that's very much, maybe not an Asian American experience, but a diaspora experience that I think is very present in the show. As diasporic subjects, the history that we come from that sustains us can never fully be understood or seen in its entirety. The past appears in bite-sized fragments. Food becomes, Larissa Lai said in conversation with me about this, a compensation. So I want to walk now and start with the kitchen table at Amanda Ross Ho's installation over there. So the oversized kitchen table in Amanda Ross Ho's installation makes me think about this experience of food as compensation, and also as this kind of thing that maybe stands in for the things that we can't quite talk about or confront. Ho's use of scale often speaks to the way that memory and value morph the scale of things as we remember them. Some of her sculptures have involved an oversized worn t-shirt emblazoned with Mickey Mouse, a large blue glove sullied with paint, or an eye mask or a face mask. The table here is large because it is the site where untold family histories spill out in incomplete fragments, pieces of a puzzle one is not encouraged to put together. And the surface of the table here is covered seemingly in food, but in reality they are plastic props from her father's photo shoots. Amanda Ross Ho's work, also, you guys can feel free to please Don't make me feel like I'm on a weird stage with this food. Amanda Russ-Ho's work in the show really moves me because I think she's similar in age to me, and I imagine she's at the age where the balance of power and ability is starting to shift, where one starts to see in the near future the moment where you start to parent your parents, and simultaneously it makes you, kind of recognize their fragility and wonder, what did they hope for when they were my age? What did they, what were they doing, and what did they want to be doing? The waterlogged damage to this portrait of Amanda Russ-Ho's father in the back here, also enlarged, makes us consider the path through damage, the incidental conditions that a person lives through. He appears underneath the turquoise stain, still smiling, still willing to stage the picture-perfect but inedible props, the plastic food that one builds their new American life in the image of. The pearls in Amy Yao's work, as well as the clams in her sculptures, also make me think about the importance of materials we treasure that also sustain us and travel with us. I always wanted to play with my food. My father somewhat encouraged this by pointing the cooked fish towards me and making me talk to its head. He'd be like, "Candice, do I taste yummy? Do you want to eat me?" And while my mom wouldn't allow me to take the chicken head that was garnishing the plate of beautiful chicken at the restaurant, he would sometimes be my accomplice and wrap it in a napkin so I could play with it with my toy horses later. My sister and I also carefully saved everything from clamshells like those that appear in Amy Yao's work, iridescent abalone shells, and even the metallic foil wrappers from Andy's Mints and Reese's Pieces. I should say you're supposed to take your shoes off, and people are excited to have the Asian experience of removing your shoes before entering a soft carpeted area. It's like the home. You can join in this very, very Asian experience. So there's a hoarded and loving aspect to Amy's work where the collected shells and pearls that are in the rice and other materials are very lovingly combined. And I also think it's really interesting, I should also come in, the way cross-section is happening in Amy's sculptures, because it's something I usually associate with biomedical images of the body, images of science, but here they've kind of been these pipes that are filled with wads of concrete and plaster and shells and pearls that are then cut open and revealed in this kind of bodily way. And given the way that Amy's interest in materials become stand-ins for people and notions of belonging through the way that they're described as invasive or native, it's interesting to think about how the cross-section is operating here. Usually the cross-section is a kind of clinical format of examination or control, a way to gain mastery over a subject through a sense of overview. And I think that is in a really interesting tension with the messiness or handledness of the way that she touches and arranges materials that clearly have a lot of meaning to her. In some cases, other people might see them as trash, but she's repurposed them here to be these kind of beautiful hoarded treasures. And hanging here above us in this web, Anna Sue Hoy's cut-ups of button-down shirts activate questions for me around immigrant Asian sensibilities of frugality, saving, recycling, misuse, and use. So much of the taboo around being an artist or trying to be one within the strictures of an immigrant Asian upbringing for me was about the misuse of objects, so-called misuse, and what was called the wastefulness of art making. I remember being really proud of an assemblage I made, early assemblage, 1982, maybe, with craft cheese folded into tiny little towers and little bitten nubs of apple, maybe not that young, a little older. And I wanted to save it, and my parents were like, "Don't waste that food." So there's this kind of way that I see these office shirts that are, supposed to have a kind of corporate decorum. And I imagine the young Anna Sue Hoy similarly altering her clothes with artistic holes and slices. Oh, I also, ever the fashionista, I always say that Anna's like the best dressed person, and she'll be like, oh, this grungy t-shirt, whatever, but she always just looks really good. And I wonder if she got similar scoldings for like maybe cutting holes in her t-shirts at a young age and doing weird things, wearing sweaters as pants or something. The office down shirt, the epitome of proper work dress code, is repurposed here into a sprawling web that engulfs the space and marks the boundary into the softer place of the exhibition. It seems like it's about rethinking levels of obedience to decorum, to society, and to assimilation into a work office culture, as we hear the howling. It's an act of refusal of these imperatives, and also an act of joyful creativity and repurposing and asserting the value of misuse, the value of art making. When Anna and I are sometimes in the UCLA ceramics lab working together in the summer usually, where we have access to the larger kilns, I'm always amazed to see her way of working, which is so different than my own. I sometimes get I'm very practical, because as Anne said, I'm a Capricorn, so we lead with practicality. And I sometimes get, also people can come in, take off your shoes. I think there's a difference in how it feels when you're inside here too. I can sometimes get kind of bogged down by the practicalities or the limits of my own skills or what the material can do. And when I watch Anna's way of working, she doesn't seem to put those practical, her Pisces-ness doesn't seem to put those practical boundaries on herself, but she starts with the kind of idea first and all its kind of bigness and dreaminess and unwieldiness. And so I actually never knew this, but I was reading in the catalog that these cage works come out of your thinking and listening to news about the immigration politics and kids being kept in cages at the US-Mexico border. And I imagine you kind of taking this into your soft Pisces sweetheart and having so much capacity for feeling and wanting to dismantle these cages, and that kind of being the overarching concern rather than what can I do to illustrate it. It more became about this desire to make physical, this dismantling. And so in this case, even though you're not supposed to put metal in the kiln, she created the kind of dismantling of these cages, breaking open and warping under the heat and pressure of the kiln, which is what you see kind of as they're combined with these psychic grotto forms out of clay, and they're kind of covered in these peeling, scabby glazes that also seem to be kind of opening and falling apart. So her endless experimentation has succeeded in creating a work that makes this kind of palpable, physical, visual sense of a world where cages have been melted, eroded, and broken open. And this larger commitment to a kind of justice-minded abolition framework is something that Anna's also been bringing a lot to our work in the ceramics lab as we're kind of shaping the area around ideas of social justice and community. And like these melting cages in the kiln, these office shirts and the conformity and capitalism that they speak of take a kind of new form of a web that tangles us into a new way of relation, or rather shows us how we're already tangled in a same kind of web of relation. Okay, go over here now. Michelle Lopez also activates a kind of purposeful misuse of a thing that takes meaning of its matter. She uses the term wilted ideologies to describe this strategy. She says, quote, "My work has a lot to do with creating sculptures out of these wilted ideologies. You have a flag or flagpole, and there's something just not right, or it's exposing the mechanism of a system. I'm trying to create an inversion of these different iconographies and have them collapse in on themselves and expose them so that we see contradictions, because they are both negative associations but also moments of hope." In Michelle Lopez's work, the material language of disciplinary power, the barricades and fences used to police and kennel protesters uprising to assert their rights as citizens to speak out against racial justice or against the genocide of Palestinians, In Lopez's hands, these materials become disassembled and unruly. Lopez shows us how systems of control undo themselves by their own wrongheadedness and unsustainability. And they get shaped and choreographed by the beautiful energy that they seek to hold in, but cannot. And they are bent and changed by the very material of collective force. This work also reminds me of a clock, the way that it's rotating and forcing you to pay attention so that you don't get hit, which has almost happened to me several times by this like clear cinder block. You just see it out of the corner of your eye coming towards you. And this cyclical aspect makes me think a lot about what people call the pendulum of history, and the way that it is always like swinging even when you're really depressed, and you're like, well, at least it's gonna swing and change, I hope. And the role of people's protests in ensuring that these cycles of change keep happening. I'm gonna talk about 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯 and 𝘵𝘰𝘰's film, which is a little small in there, so maybe people can take turns kind of going through there while I talk about the work. The flood in 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯 and Vishal's video becomes an environmental symbol or surrogate for this huge thing we're unable to face, climate change, which parallels family histories that are unable to be faced, and the social political history of racial tension in Guyana. So this kind of layered obliqueness of things that are buried under the flood. We're told the story of the flood from multiple perspectives. A journalist, oh, I lost my water a while ago somewhere. A journalist, a historian, and geographer, and various voices of what I interpret to be members of 𝘵𝘰𝘰's family talking to him as he asks questions about family history, flood, gender, and race. There's one conversation where he's joking with the historian about how his uncle's story of getting lost in the jungle and trying to have to find his way out is a kind of classic manhood story. And then a little later he goes, and what about the women? And then another voice goes, sorry? Like, what about the women? And then there's just this silence and this image of the flood and all its subterranean opaque depth. And so I take the flood to mean this kind of, this image of that holds everything that isn't reckoned with, talked about. And it's an image that withholds the spectacularization of violence, even though like the flood itself is an image of violence and catastrophe. It withholds and has a kind of mismatch with the audio that we hear, which is often about retellings of racial violence, a history of slavery and indentureship, streets full of water, mismanagement of cities and water systems, riots. And then often we like hearing these things, but all we're seeing is this kind of blanketed image of the flood. For 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯, I imagine that his investment in this is kind of different than Vishal's. He's like a brother to me, my annoying brother. I love him. And he has an oblique way of moving through ideas, very different than the practical Capricorn way of going through ideas. And he has an interest in tracing systems of time, or what he would call the project of Western spatiotemporality, to be more exact. And I imagine that his interests might be more philosophical. He, at one point in the video, is saying something, I don't remember the exact quote, but he says something like, these are all different containers. They show us the shape of extraction. It's about this shape that gets revealed from like these different perspectives, the historian, the journalist, the family. For 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯, I believe the flood is less about the particularities of a family history that are buried beneath the surface, which Vish actively longs to dredge out and understand. But I think for 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯, it's maybe more about the cyclical nature and shape of extraction and violence in all its forms. The flood of 2005 echoes the flood of 2021, which echoes the social floods of racial violence in Guyana's long history of slavery and indentured labor, and the tension of groups that kind of is the afterlives and aftermath of that history. One thing that I think is really interesting about this work is the flood image is AI generated, which usually is not an interesting thing, but in this case it is. Well, that's just my opinion. So I spent a long time thinking about the AI-generated jungle landscape of the flood, intercut intermittently with like this kind of family footage and images from newsreels. And it makes sense to me that the landscape that we see is unreal because the landscape comes to us from plantation farming, and that's kind of the basis also of a lot of our current day monocrop agribusiness. And that is tied to the artificial and unreal, although the climate effects of that is very real. So this human intervened landscape, the space of the plantation, is echoed here in this faux natural space of the AI-generated jungle. The flooded landscape becomes symbolic of all the history that is lost in the diaspora, the details that are not known or traumas that are not spoken of, the stories of the marginal that fall outside the manhood narratives of mastering the landscape. Somewhere under the floodwater, we could hear, what about the women? We could hear from the drowned, we could hear from the silenced. And the excess of information that is held by the simple image of the AI-generated flooded landscape, I'm reminded of Saidiya Hartman's book, 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯 Lives, where she's like describing these archival photos and you're like looking at them trying to match it with what she's describing, and there's a mismatch because she's actually describing in some cases things that could have been, very likely were happening, but aren't present in the archives because of power. And in a conversation in 2019 at the Hammer Museum with Arthur Jaffa, he kind of calls her out on this and he's like, so what's this deal with you in like fact and fiction? And she says, often fact is simply fiction endorsed with state power, fact and truth. Before they had genetic testing, you could look through old issues of Ebony magazine and see Thomas Jefferson's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Like, we always knew what truth was in the absence of certain kinds of evidence or fact to demonstrate that. I think that the difference between fiction and nonfiction has everything to do with power. And who has the power and authority to advance truth claims? Who has the power and authority to make certain kinds of statements about the world that need be attended to? And then she goes on to talk about fictions of the state that get produced in order to conduct and justify the kind of work of the state's disciplinary and punishment project, and how, in her writing, what she's striving to do, and what I think Vishal and 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯 are doing in their work, is creating counterfictions to the kind of fiction of the state. So I think that the flood in Vish and 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯's video acts as the surface of ungiving depth, where the things we know are reflected back, but with a depth that speaks to all that is lost and unknown. It is told through family stories and through rumors, without the state-endorsed power to become facts. This is, I believe, one of the conditions of diaspora experience, this piecing together of entangled family and historical past and lost elements of culture that can be guessed at, alluded to, but never fully recaptured or known. So, I'm gonna move again. If in 𝘵𝘰𝘰𝘯 and Vish's video, political family history is felt through the environmental landscape, in 𝘠𝘤𝑚 Min's work, the social landscape is felt through the body of the artist. Defining Moments is a unique photo work by 𝘠𝘤𝑚 Min, a dear friend of mine who passed earlier this year and whose estate I've been putting in order with Stevie and Carolyn and a team of others who are here, some of them. Defining Moments was made at Lightwork in a photo residency she did in Syracuse, and as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Eddie and Carolyn, who know her work very well, is the only one she did using traditional ways of photo collage. The other works that I know where she used layering and collage and printing were done by physically cutting into the images or digitally photoshopping, digitally collaging. Yeah, maybe, how should we do this? Maybe people can circulate it out. This project was made in the context of the 1992 LA uprising and traces a series of dates written in a spiral radiating from a photo of her belly button, which shows how the personal and historical are intertwined. It begins with the year of her birth, the year of the Korean armistice that began the uneasy agreement between North and South Korea, which has haunted much of Young-soon's other artworks. Actually, I'm going to use this as a shout out moment. One of her unfinished artworks, which we've been working on, the Kiss with 5 S's, or maybe it's just Kiss with 5 S's, I think there's no the, will be opening with research images and pre-production photos of this unfinished artwork at the Contemporary Art Center in Irvine in October 5th. I think it's competing with the ICA's next opening, which is also October 5th. But come to our show instead. But in this work, you can see the way that the armistice, the 1953 armistice haunts her work still, because it's kind of related to Magritte's painting, The Lovers, where people's heads are covered in text cloth and they're trying to kiss. But in this case, they're covered in the flags of different nations that are both affected by and shaping the armistice history. So further in the spiral of dates on her belly are the April 19th revolution, where President Syngman Rhee's government was overthrown, which actually happened during the time that Young-soon was a child, and so she witnessed that. May 19th, 1980 marks the Gwangju uprising, where people, many of them students like now, took to the streets in protest of the military coup on the 17th that installed Chun Doo-won as the military dictator. This uprising was violently suppressed by the South Korean military and many people were killed. And it was also the beginning of the Gwangju democratization movement, which I had to learn about when I did the Gwangju biennial. They made us all go in 100-some degree weather to visit all these sites. And I was like, why are we doing this weird patriotic thing? But I didn't realize the kind of struggle it came out of and why it was important. And Young-soon was a big part of the Gwangju biennial. She curated one of the first ones, I think the fourth one, in 2002 or something. 2002, and it's not in my notes, and then was also a participant in it several other times. So it's a very important art event that came out of this kind of democratic history that is then in the work itself. 4/29/92, of course, marks the LA uprising in the wake of the Rodney King beating and the killing of Latasha Harlins by a Korean shop owner, and the subsequent violence and destruction of much of Koreatown and Korean-owned businesses elsewhere in the city. 4/29 was also Young-soon's birthday and held personal significance in multiple ways. You'll see on the first and last image, in defining moments, there's text etched into the glass, and the text on the last one starts with "no ordinary landscape," referring to the volcanic lake that is Bakdusan, located between China and North Korea, where the origin myth of the Koreans originates. The first set of text is her diasporic variation of the well-known Scottish folk song, "My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean," which reads instead, "My body lies over the ocean, my body lies over the sea, my body lies over the DMZ, oh bring back my body to me, bring back, oh bring back my body to me." It's hard for me to read those words and not think about the ocean as the ocean between the living and the dead. It's hard for me to read those words and not think about her body towards the end of her life, covered in necrotic scars from cancer treatment, bumpy and purple and blackened, the artificial port embedded in her skin where they put the chemo medicine in. This was her literal body that her indomitable spirit seemed to deny could ever stop her. She seemed to have so much energy and sheer will, even in her last days. I didn't believe her body could defeat her. And now her body lies over the ocean, but there is the body of her artwork in boxes and folders and piles and heaps in her garage and sheds that we slowly go through. And these artworks are filled with images of her own body and the social body and how entangled it all was with all the people and all the relationships she made the core of the way she lived her life. In Patty Chang's work, the social and environmental landscape are literally felt through bodies, the body of the artist child, and through the porpoises and the children they breastfeed with the toxic breast milk that poisons while it feeds. In the video, Patty describes a ritual she asks her collaborator, 𝘚𝘤𝘬𝘯𝘨, the scientist conducting the necropsies on the dead porpoises, and also the sister of the writer she references, 𝘚𝘤𝘬𝘯𝘨, who wrote Bodies of Water. She asks Alexei to take a moment and put her hand on the body of the dead porpoise. And actually what we see in this, or don't see in these photos that are on the table, are these kind of moments of the ritual. And Patty asks, what is a touch archive if touching is what destroys the archive? She speculates then that the best archive is the archive of the body. Much like the work of Young-Soon Min, who Patty Chang was also dear friends with and who actively cared for her during her illness, Patty and Young-Soon know how our bodies are containers for history, for trauma, for larger environmental effects, toxicities, family intimacies, and all our relationships with world and other. In the video, she relates drinking milk, the first act of survival, slowly poisons the calf, the baby porpoise, because of the way that the environmental toxins build up in milk. Milk, meant to be soothing and nourishing, unwittingly causes the opposite effect than what mother porpoise would want, what Patty calls the cruel irony of killing offspring slowly to survive the self. The title of this work, We Are All Mothers, speaks to the way that we are all entangled, all archived in each other's bodies, including, but beyond, the biological idea of mother or kinship. She references the artist and scholar Latipa's idea of archival futurism, the archive as a space of intimacy between the dead, the living, and those that are yet to be born. Chang writes of intergenerational entanglements. In Chinese Buddhism, the child owes an unpayable debt to its mother for the milk it was fed as an infant. The milk debt can only be returned through payments to the mother's afterlife. This intergenerational way that sustenance and milk is passed on as an unforgettable debt is mirrored by the way that intergenerational trauma, or the toxic, is also passed on from body to body, which reminds me of another diasporic writer, Ocean Vuong, and his classic novel, which is based in some way upon his life experiences. The boy, Little Dog, narrating the story, recounts his life with his mother in the US and the way the trauma of war in Vietnam haunts their family life, including bouts of physical abuse from his mother, even though the war was in the past long before he was born. He writes, one time while pruning a basket of green beans over the sink, you said out of nowhere, I'm not a monster, I'm a mother. What do we mean when we say survivor? Maybe a survivor is the last one to come home, the final monarch that lands on a branch already weighted with ghosts. The morning closed in around us. I put down the book. The heads of green beans went on snapping. They thunked in the steel sink like fingers. You're not a monster, I lied, but I lied. What I really wanted to say was that a monster is not such a terrible thing to be, from the Latin root monstrum, the divine messenger of catastrophe, then adapted by the Old French to mean an animal of myriad origins, a centaur, griffin, satyr. To be a monster is to be a hybrid signal, a lighthouse, both shelter and warning at once. I read that parents suffering from PTSD are more likely to hit their children. Perhaps there is a monstrous origin to it after all. Perhaps to lay hands on your child is to prepare him for war. To say possessing a heartbeat is never as simple as the heart's task of saying yes, yes, yes to the body. I don't know. In looking at this exhibition and thinking about avoidance, loss, fragments, entanglement, I also thought about the Chinese idea of losing face, like faith, not faith, like religion, but like your face. I remember being struck by this phrase and wondering, how does one lose one's face? It sounds kind of cool, maybe I want to lose my face. What I decided as a kid was that avoiding losing one's face meant looking indirectly or sideways and never directly at painful or discrete, painful or embarrassing things, and avoiding topics that might cause another person discomfort or embarrassment, and avoiding actions that might make you stick out from a group and embarrass yourself, or worse, your family. Being queer and an artist and an immigrant Chinese household and not a doctor and a lawyer like most our friends, family, kids were, I felt that I made my parents lose face, or at least caused them some embarrassment or discomfort and not knowing what to do with this differentness. And I feel like this show is kind of full of that kind of Asian American perspective, maybe. The being the odd one out in an Asian immigrant family household, maybe poking the thing you shouldn't poke, looking directly at the thing that is too uncomfortable to look directly at, or doing the thing you're definitely not supposed to do. Maybe this is a show of monsters, monstrums, hybrid signals, a lighthouse, a shelter, and a warning. But perhaps the avoidance of a thing that causes discomfort or pain is a very natural response, not specific to Asian American upbringing. We hear Patty Chang and We Are All Mothers say that the idea for this installation actually came from her son Leroy, who came into her studio, and then he was really upset by the sight of these lifeless bodies, and his response was to turn them upside down to show his displeasure. Maybe it only becomes a loss of faith when it is instilled as a cultural value of conformity rather than interrupted by a ritual, a slowing down, by a request to place a hand tenderly upon the body, to feel its archive and, through touch, let your own body become an archive. As Patty reminds us, touch goes both ways. Thank you.
Would you be willing to take a few questions?
Yeah. I do need my water, I don't know where I put it.
Do people have questions?
Candice, where can we get a copy of that?
That was my question. Can we circulate? She'll be publishing it in a year or two.
No.
Any other questions? How does a cat give a tour of an art show?
Not very well.
Very badly. He basically, on the one that I was there, first we did our own tour, which was not a tour, but because I know my own art, but kind of. But we were in the space together, and he was into the one that rotated and had water, and then he listened to the one that had me pretending to be a cat howling, and he was like, you don't sound like a cat. And then when people came that wanted the tour, he was like, I already saw this show. I'm not going back in there. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how the rest of the tours are gonna go, but it's up to him.
Sorry, Carmen.
I was wondering if you still grapple with that moment of like the cheese that you were talking about when you were young, the cheese and apples. Does that moment still come up when you're making art now?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I make bad decisions still because I don't want to waste things, or the whole reason I now make cat art, which I don't know how I feel about it, is because I didn't want to waste the extra paint from making my more serious paintings from Pigs and Poison. So I was like, oh, Roger's here, I'll just paint him with this extra paint. And then now look at me, I have cat-led tours, so who knows? But I also do a lot of things that I don't think are, that still have a lot of shame. Well, I am a little ashamed about the cat stuff, even though it's a contradiction. But I do things because I don't want to waste things, and I don't think that it serves the art that well. I think it's better to be like Anna and have like the vision of the thing rather than the practicality or like the whatever.
I use all those shirts because my mother cannot throw my father's shirts away post-retirement. And then I asked my uncles if they still have shirts, and they still did too. Because they can't throw anything away.
Yeah.
So I'm like, trying to make art out of their stuff they can't throw away.
Yeah.
It's very Asian, more Okay.
Scanning the room. Last year. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.